The church hall thundered with angry voices as Martha said, "You lied to us, Pastor James." Her trembling hands clutched the crumpled ledger she had uncovered. The room smelled of sweat and betrayal, candles flickering shadows on frightened faces. David shouted, "We gave you everything, and you fed us lies." His voice cracked like splintering wood, fear and rage tangled together. Pastor James, standing at the pulpit, smiled faintly, his eyes cold, unblinking. He said, "You were never forced. You followed willingly." A gasp tore through the congregation as betrayal sank in. Rachel whispered, "All of us, deceived, together." The air felt like iron, choking throats with shame and fury. The once holy room had become a battlefield of faith destroyed. The scam had unraveled in an instant, and trust lay dead on the church floor. Rachel clutched her chest as anger rippled through the crowd, voices colliding in chaos. She said, "How could we not see this?" Her words cut into silence for a moment. David turned to her, jaw trembling. "Because we trusted too much, we wanted to believe." Martha slammed the ledger on the pew, its echo cracking like thunder. Her face twisted. "He robbed us blind in the name of God." Pastor James raised a hand, calm against fury, his voice firm. "You gave freely, I only guided." But the truth was clear. Every soul had been tricked, faith used as currency. Shame fell heavy on their shoulders, like a weight impossible to lift. The storm outside roared louder, mirroring the breaking faith inside. Martha said, "We are fools, all of us." Her cry pierced the hall, cutting through the storm. David leaned close, voice sharp, "No, Martha. He's the deceiver, not us." Rachel turned toward the pulpit, trembling. "Then why does he still stand there, unafraid?" she whispered. Pastor James spread his arms, his expression serene. He said, "Fear not. Truth is still mine to hold." But the crowd groaned, the air so tense it seemed the church itself would crack. Trust was gone, and only betrayal remained. David stepped into the aisle, his boots pounding, eyes blazing toward the pulpit. He said, "You stole our faith, James." The congregation erupted in shouts, some calling for truth, others too shocked to speak. Martha sobbed, "I gave my last savings to you." Pastor James tilted his head, his calm mask unnerving. "I offered hope," he said softly. Rachel's hands trembled as she grabbed David's arm. "Stop, he's twisting everything still," she cried. The storm rattled the walls, voices clashing, the sacred place now a chamber of rage. The tension reached a breaking pitch. Martha screamed, "You destroyed families." Her voice cracked into sobs. David roared, "We'll see justice." His words echoed, shaking the hall. Pastor James finally raised both hands, commanding silence. "Justice?" he asked, smirking. "You speak of justice, but you begged for miracles." Rachel whispered, tears streaming, "We begged for truth." The congregation fell quiet, breathless. It felt like standing on the edge of collapse, waiting for the floor to break beneath them. The storm's fury outside softened to a low growl as Rachel sat hunched in the pew, her hands trembling over the hymnal she once held with devotion. She whispered, "I believed his every word, every promise." Martha's voice cracked as she said, "So did I, child. We all wanted something to cling to." David clenched his jaw, fists tightening at his sides, muttering, "Hope blinded us, and he wore that mask too well." The congregation shifted in uneasy silence, eyes darting from one betrayed soul to another. Pastor James stood tall, his calm expression unnerving, like a predator savoring the collapse of its prey. Rachel's tears streaked down her face as she whispered, "I trusted him more than myself." The weight of her confession dragged the air heavy with sorrow. The room no longer felt holy, it felt broken, stripped bare of innocence. Rachel turned her face toward Martha, her voice breaking. "When my husband left, James told me faith would heal the emptiness." Martha's eyes softened, sorrow replacing her rage. She said, "And I thought my savings would buy me peace for my children." David slammed his palm against the pew. "He fed on our wounds," he growled, like he studied them. Pastor James smiled faintly, saying, "I offered healing, not deceit." Rachel shook her head, sobbing, "Healing doesn't steal what little we had left." The hall quieted, every eye on her trembling form. Her words revealed the pain beneath the fury, and for the first time, the others saw not just betrayal, but the raw wounds that led them here. The silence was thick, broken only by the whisper of rain. Martha lowered her gaze, her voice trembling. "I mortgaged my home, Rachel. My children think I was foolish." She clutched the ledger, tears falling. Rachel gasped, covering her mouth. "He took everything from you too." David leaned forward, his voice rough. "He played us all, feeding hope until we starved for truth." Pastor James' tones sliced the air. "You were never starved. You were chosen to believe." Martha shook her head violently, whispering, "Chosen to be fools." The words spread through the congregation like fire, sparking sobs and groans. Rachel held Martha's hand tightly, her fingers cold, desperate to comfort. In that fragile moment, the bond between victims burned stronger than the preacher's lies. David turned, his eyes scanning the crowd, voice thunderous. "How many of you gave because he said salvation had a price?" Murmurs rose, faces pale, eyes glistening with shame. An older man buried his face in his hands, while a young woman clutched her child, whispering prayers. Rachel cried, "We gave because we wanted to believe life could be better." Martha's voice cracked. "We gave because we were desperate." Pastor James raised both arms, declaring, "Desperation brought you closer to truth, not away from it." His words echoed hollow, no longer carrying authority, only manipulation. The congregation shivered, realizing their deepest wounds had been currency for the scam. Rachel's sobs slowed as she whispered, "He promised me family when I had none." Her words pierced the silence, leaving the congregation trembling. Martha placed her arm gently around her, voice filled with grief. "You're not alone anymore, Rachel. We are all victims of his hunger." David clenched his fists, his voice raw. "We'll make sure he never deceives again." Pastor James smirked, eyes glittering with arrogance. "Victims," he said, "you call yourselves victims, but you came to me willingly." His words rang sharp, but for the first time, the crowd seemed less broken, more united. Betrayal had cracked their faith, but in the fragments they began to see one another. The storm rumbled like a warning drum outside, but inside, Pastor James' voice filled the hall, smooth and commanding. "Do not fear. What I've built is stronger than doubt," he declared. His words slid through the silence like silk over glass. Rachel's lips quivered as she whispered, "I believed him once, and even now part of me wants to." Her chest rose unevenly, pulled between memory and betrayal. David's jaw clenched, his fists curling tight as he muttered, "That's the poison. He knows how to make lies taste like hope." Martha drew the ledger close, her eyes hollow. "He spoke of salvation, but these numbers tell another gospel," she whispered. Pastor James' faint smirk lingered as he stepped closer to the edge of the pulpit, his dark eyes sweeping across the congregation. "You call me a liar, yet you stayed by my side for years," he said. The congregation sat frozen, hearts split in two, spellbound and shattered. Rachel's hands twisted in her lap as her voice cracked. "Maybe he meant well, at least in the beginning," she whispered. Her confession lingered like a fragile string of hope. David turned, eyes burning, his words sharp as knives. "That's what he counts on, your mercy, your softness." He slammed his fist onto the wooden pew, the sound echoing like thunder. Martha lifted her trembling hand, her eyes glistening with rage. "No. He knew exactly what he was doing from the start. I see it now. Every sermon was rehearsed, every smile rehearsed." Pastor James leaned forward, the corners of his lips curling into a practiced smile. "Mercy is the only path to forgiveness," he said smoothly. "Without it, you are lost." His voice slithered through the silence, pulling some eyes toward him in guilty longing. Rachel's tears spilled as she shook her head, torn apart. "Healing doesn't bleed us dry," she said, her voice breaking. The air tightened as Martha leaned closer, her whisper trembling. I saw him whispering with Henry weeks ago, his eyes lit like they shared a secret. Rachel froze, her stomach dropping. Henry, she gasped. He's been my friend since I was a child. Her voice cracked like breaking glass. David's brow furrowed, suspicion flashing in his eyes. If Henry's part of this, then the rot is deeper than we thought. Pastor James' smirk deepened, his voice rising with mocking ease. Look how quickly you suspect your own. That is how fear eats you alive. Rachel shook her head, denial colliding with fear. No. Henry wouldn't betray me. He couldn't, she whispered, though her eyes betrayed doubt. The congregation stirred uneasily, whispers rising, glances flickering toward the back of the hall. Doubt was a shadow creeping into every corner, and for the first time, trust among the victims began to unravel. Rachel's hands trembled violently as she pressed them together in prayer-like desperation. If Henry betrayed us, she whispered, then I have nothing left. David stepped closer, resting his hand firmly on her shoulder. Don't blame yourself, he said with quiet fire. Betrayal is his weapon, not yours. His gaze flicked toward the pulpit. Martha's jaw set hard, bitterness dripping from her words. The truth is, none of us wanted to see the signs. We were too eager to believe. Pastor James raised his head with calm defiance, his voice cutting. Signs? No, what you saw were blessings. You accepted them willingly, begged for them even. The congregation groaned, guilt and rage mixing in the air. Rachel's tears streaked down her face, her voice breaking but strong. I trusted him more than my own blood, she confessed. Her words struck the crowd like a hammer blow, leaving silence that screamed. Thunder cracked like the heavens splitting, but no one moved. Martha's voice rose, brittle and fierce. Every sermon was a chain, she said, every word a lock that kept us bound. David growled in agreement, his fists shaking, and we carried the keys, blind to the trap, praising the one who chained us. Rachel's sobs slowed, her breath ragged. She lifted her face, pale and streaked with tears, her eyes red yet steady. Pastor James' arms spread wide, his tone fiery and unwavering. Faith is no trap. Faith is the light that binds you. You are ungrateful children, spitting on salvation. His words boomed, but the spell had cracked. Rachel drew a long, trembling breath, her voice cutting through the hall like a blade. No, she said, her tone steady now. Faith doesn't bleed us dry. The words rang like a bell, silencing even the storm outside for a breath. The storm outside cracked like judgment as Martha's words echoed. Henry, you knew. She pointed toward the back, her arm trembling. The congregation turned, faces pale. Henry, once the quiet friend everyone trusted, froze under the weight of their stares. Rachel's voice broke. Tell me it isn't true. Tell me you weren't part of this. Henry's lips parted, no sound emerging at first. Finally he muttered, I only wanted to help him. Gasps spread through the pews like wildfire. David lunged forward, fury shaking his voice. You betrayed us for him? Pastor James' smirk deepened, his voice steady. Not betrayed, enlightened. He stood with truth while the rest of you clung to doubt. Rachel staggered, her eyes filling with tears that burned. You were my family, Henry, she whispered, her heart shattering as trust collapsed like broken glass. Rachel stumbled into the aisle, her voice desperate. Why, Henry, you knew what I gave up. You knew my pain. Henry's shoulders slumped, eyes glistening. He promised it would all mean something. He promised would change lives. Martha hissed, change? He drained us. David's fists clenched, voice booming. You stood by while he robbed, families blind. Pastor James raised a hand, calm. Henry believed because he had vision, not weakness. Rachel's chest heaved, tears dripping as she whispered, no, he believed because you owned him, just like you owned us. Silence spread, broken only by thunder. The betrayal now had a face, not just a name. Henry's guilt painted the walls darker than the storm. Rachel's sob turned to a scream as she shouted, You were supposed to protect me, Henry. Her voice tore through the hall, raw and jagged. Henry's face twisted, his voice small. I thought I was. James said you'd be safe if I kept quiet. David shook his head, rage burning in his eyes. Safe? She was chained in lies. Martha's trembling hands clutched the ledger to her chest. You took my children's future, Henry. For what? His approval. Pastor James' voice cut through, sharp and proud. He stood for me because he saw the greater plan. Rachel's knees weakened, her body folding as she sobbed. No plan justifies betrayal. The crowd erupted in cries, the spell of silence shattered. The storm howled as if mocking the chaos within. David strode into the aisle, his voice thunderous. You betrayed every soul in this room, Henry. And for what? Coins in your pocket? A pat on the back? Henry's voice cracked. I wanted to belong. I wanted purpose. Rachel's tears blurred her vision. You had family with me, she cried, her voice breaking. Martha shouted, and you sold it for lies. Pastor James clapped his hands once, the sound sharp. Enough. His loyalty gave him power, something none of you ever earned. The words echoed as the crowd recoiled. For the first time they saw Henry not as victim, but as willing accomplice. The truth cut deeper than any sermon. Rachel's voice lowered to a whisper that carried heavier than any scream. Henry, you weren't deceived. You chose this. Her words broke him more than the shouting. Henry's knees buckled as he fell forward, sobbing. I thought it was for something bigger, he confessed. Martha shook her head in disgust. No cause justifies betrayal. David's voice was cold as iron. You traded your soul for a liar's smile. Pastor James leaned forward, his voice low and venomous. And yet, through him, I stood unchallenged for years. The hall erupted, cries rising, fists pounding pews. Rachel sank to her knees, her sobs drowned by the roar of voices. Betrayal no longer lurked in shadows. It was here, unveiled, undeniable, and merciless. The storm slammed against the stained glass as if heaven itself demanded justice. David stepped into the aisle, fury blazing. It ends tonight, James. His voice shook the rafters. Pastor James raised his chin, eyes unblinking. Ends? No, David, this is only beginning. Rachel clutched the edge of the pew, her breath ragged. You bled us dry and called it salvation. Her cry cracked like thunder. Martha pressed the ledger high above her head. Here is your gospel. Nothing but greed and lies. The congregation erupted, voices colliding in rage and despair. Pastor James slammed his palm on the pulpit, the sharp crack silencing them. You call me a thief, yet every coin you gave was offered freely, he roared. Rachel's tears burned as she whispered, We gave you trust, and you murdered it. The air felt like it might split open, suffocating all inside. Rachel staggered to her feet, her voice raw. You promised me family when I had none, and I believed you. Her words pierced the chaos, striking deep. Henry, still on his knees, lifted his head. Rachel, I thought I was protecting you, he sobbed. David's face twisted in rage. Protecting her? You chained her to a liar. Martha's voice shook with fury. You fed his hunger, Henry. You let him strip us all. Pastor James leaned forward, his words sharp. No, Henry stood in faith unlike you cowards. Rachel's sobbing cut off, her voice rising like fire. Faith doesn't demand blood. It doesn't leave us empty. The hall thundered with stomping feet, the congregation turning into a storm of its own. Pastor James gripped the pulpit, veins visible in his neck, yet his smirk held. The hall roared like a battlefield. David pointed at Pastor James, his face red with fury. You are no shepherd. You are a wolf. Pastor James' eyes narrowed, his voice venomous. And still you followed me. What does that make you? Gasps tore through the crowd. Martha's voice shook but grew louder. You twisted faith into chains, and we let you. Rachel trembled, yet her voice grew firm. Not anymore. She turned to the crowd, her tears glistening. We are not his flock. We are survivors of his lies. A murmur spread through the congregation, strength rising from their brokenness. Pastor James pounded the pulpit. You think you are free. You are weak without me. But for the first time his voice did not command them. It strained, cracking at the edges like glass about to shatter. Martha thrust the ledger toward the crowd, her voice cracking. Here is proof. Every stolen dollar, every lie written in ink. Gasps filled the air as pages fluttered in the storm's draft. Rachel shouted, Look at us broken, bleeding. He built it from our pain. David stepped forward, his voice a roar. Your empire is nothing but dust, James. Pastor James slammed both fists on the pulpit, his voice a howl. You begged me for miracles and I gave them. Henry collapsed again, sobbing. No, you gave us chains. The congregation shouted louder, their voices rising against James like a tide. Rachel's hands shook, but her voice grew stronger. You are finished. The storm outside screamed like a witness to the collapse. For the first time James' smirk faltered. The climax struck like lightning. Rachel pointed straight at Pastor James, her voice cutting through the chaos. You will not break us again. The congregation roared in agreement, stomping the floor. Martha's sobbing became fierce resolve. You stole from us, but you cannot steal what we still have. Each other. David shouted, Your lies end here. Pastor James leaned forward, his face dark with fury. You think you've won? You are nothing without me. Rachel's tears gleamed as she screamed, No, James, we are everything without you. The congregation's voices crashed like a wave, drowning out his roar. For the first time, Pastor James looked small at his pulpit, the predator cornered by prey. The church no longer belonged to him. It belonged to the people he thought he had destroyed. The uproar simmered into silence, leaving only the storm whispering through cracked windows. Rachel collapsed into the pew, her body trembling as tears streaked her face. It's over, she whispered, though her voice shook with disbelief. Martha laid the ledger on the altar, her hands heavy. These pages will haunt me, she said, her tone hollow. David's jaw tightened as he stared at James. No more sermons, no more lies. Pastor James stood frozen at the pulpit, his smirk gone, eyes darting for escape. The congregation watched, breaths shallow, as if waiting for lightning to strike. Rachel's voice steadied as she lifted her head. You took everything, James. But you can't take who we become after this. The words carried like a fragile truth, echoing through the broken church. Martha spoke, her voice sharp but fragile. We must face what's left. The home's lost. The family's broken. Her words struck the crowd harder than James' lies. Rachel reached for her hand, whispering, We'll rebuild, even if it takes everything. David stepped forward, pointing toward the pulpit. But he won't walk away untouched. Pastor James smirked faintly, though fear flickered in his eyes. You think you can cage me? Faith doesn't answer to chains. The congregation stirred uneasily, yet David's voice cut firm. This isn't about faith anymore. This is about justice. Rachel's gaze lingered on Henry, still collapsed in shame. We carry scars, but scars are proof we survive. Her words softened the room, the first sign of healing through the ruin. Rachel rose unsteadily, her voice steadier than before. We are not weak. We are not broken. We are more than what he stole. Her words spread like balm, touching the hearts around her. Martha nodded, tears glinting in her weary eyes. We'll pick up the pieces one by one. David's fists finally loosened, his chest heaving with a sigh. He'll face judgment, whether in court or by God, he won't escape. Pastor James stood still, his jaw rigid, eyes cold, but his power gone. The congregation murmured, nodding as strength returned to their faces. Rachel's final words carried into the storm. Our faith lives, but not in him. It lives in us. The silence that followed was not fear. It was the fragile beginning of healing. David walked down the aisle slowly, his boots echoing on wooden boards. He stopped at the pulpit, facing James directly. You will answer for this, he said, low but unshakable. Pastor James' lips curved faintly. The law cannot bind what faith commands. His arrogance lingered, but the fear in his eyes betrayed him. Martha stepped forward, voice firm. Then let the truth bind you. Rachel clutched her chest, whispering, "We'll heal without you." The congregation began rising, each step echoing unity, more powerful than sermons. James gripped the pulpit tighter, his knuckles white. For the first time, he looked cornered, small against the collective will of those he once ruled. The hall fell still, as the storm faded into a soft rain. Rachel's voice was the last to rise, steady as stone. "You'll never own us again." Martha placed a hand on Rachel's shoulder, whispering, "We'll walk through this together." David exhaled heavily, his rage cooling into solemn determination. "The world will know what he did," he vowed. Pastor James' eyes flicked across the room, his once commanding presence reduced to a shadow. The congregation stood shoulder to shoulder, a wall of resolve. The church was no longer his cage of lies, but their ground of renewal. Rachel closed her eyes, tears falling softly. "We may be scarred," she whispered, "but scars mean survival." The words lingered as the candles flickered, carrying hope into the night. The storm outside faded into drizzle, but the church felt heavier than ever. Rachel stood tall, though her face was pale from tears. "We will rebuild," she whispered, her voice almost breaking. Martha placed her hand firmly on her shoulder. "Together," she said, a vow rather than comfort. David looked at the crowd, his jaw tight. "This story won't be buried. The world will know what he did." The congregation murmured, strength seeping back into their broken voices. Pastor James remained at the pulpit, silent now, but his eyes still burned. Rachel turned toward him, her gaze hard. "You've lost us." Her words cut through the quiet, but James' faint smirk lingered, as if he knew something they did not. Martha lifted the ledger once more, placing it into David's hands. "Take it," she said, her voice firm. "It will be the weapon that undoes him." David nodded, clutching it tight. "No more hiding." Rachel's voice wavered but grew stronger. "These lies will be written into truth for the world to see." The congregation rose slowly, one by one, their unity filling the hall. Pastor James chuckled faintly, his voice low and sharp. "You think paper will bury me? I've lived in shadows longer than you've prayed." Rachel's lips trembled, but her words struck hard. "Then shadows will swallow you whole." The silence that followed was chilling, the air holding its breath as if waiting for judgment. Rachel stepped closer to James, her voice trembling with fury. "You promised light, but gave only darkness." His cold eyes narrowed as he replied, "And yet you followed me into it willingly." Gasps echoed as Rachel's body shook. Martha stepped forward quickly, holding her steady. "No more," Martha said, her tone sharp. David raised the ledger high. "This ends tonight, not with your lies, but with truth." James' smirk faded briefly, his jaw tightening. Rachel steadied herself, whispering, "Your time is over." The congregation thundered with agreement, stomping the floor in unison. James' calm cracked, a flicker of panic in his eyes. The predator no longer owned the room, his prey had turned against him. Henry lifted his head at last, his voice raw. "I stood with him, and I destroyed us." His tears fell heavy, dripping into silence. Rachel turned, her face softening with grief. "Then stand with truth now." Henry sobbed, nodding. "I'll testify. I'll expose every secret he hid." David's voice cut sharp. "Your words may save others, though they won't save you." Martha whispered, "Betrayal doesn't vanish, but confession brings light." Pastor James' laughter rang suddenly, sharp and mocking. "You think one man's tears can erase my power?" The congregation roared in response, their fury rising like thunder, drowning out his hollow laugh. For the first time, James's voice was powerless. The rain eased to silence, and the candles flickered low. Rachel's voice cut through the quiet, steady and cold. "You will fade into nothing, James." Pastor James leaned forward, his lips curling. "Nothing? My voice will haunt you long after I'm gone." His words dripped like poison, and for a moment, the hall froze. Martha's eyes narrowed. Haunt us all you want. Your power ends here. David stepped closer, lowering the ledger onto the altar. This is your grave, he said firmly. The congregation exhaled as one, their unity louder than any sermon. Rachel closed her eyes, whispering, "Scars remain, but scars remind us we survived." The final candle guttered out, leaving the hall in darkness, with only the echo of James' faint, chilling laugh lingering in the silence.